So I have here a copy of an interesting piece of history. This is the TNIV, which is today's New International Version. This actually predates the NIV 2011 update. It was between the 1984 NIV and the 2011 NIV. And for a time, they had this edition called the TNIV. I'm curious how many out there in the audience ever owned one of these or has read the TNIV or used the TNIV. Let me know in the comments if you have used this before. I was reading a little bit about this, and I'm going to read something that I thought was really interesting about the background of the TNIV and something that occurred to me as I was reading about it. So that's what we're going to look at in this video. So this article was written in 2002, actually, when the New Testament for the today's New International Version came out. The entire Bible was completed in 2005. The update of the NIV, the TNIV, was completed in 2005. But this gives some interesting background. It says the first inclusive language edition of the New International Version was published in the United Kingdom by Hodder and Stoughton in 1995 and 1996. Apparently, British evangelicals were so desirous of an inclusive language NIV that the International Bible Society, IBS, which by the way is now called Biblica, it says, which owns the copyright to the NIV, and the Committee on Bible Translation, the CBT, the scholars responsible for the maintenance and ongoing revision of the NIV, were willing to allow a preliminary revision of the NIV to be published in England, though they wanted to wait for the full revision of the NIV for the North American audience. So this is the background to this whole situation, which you could call a fiasco, really, of public relations with the NIV. They produced in England, in the United Kingdom, the NIV Inclusive Edition. And so this set off a firestorm of controversy. So going on here, it says, following David Scholler's celebratory review of the New International Version Inclusive Language Edition, NIVI, in 1996, events that were precipitated from the inclusive language controversy made it seem as though there would never be a revision of the NIV for the North American or any other audience. Now remember, this is being written in 2002, so they're saying in the late 90s it looked like there would never be an update to the NIV because of the controversy of the NIVI. So it goes on here. On May 27, 1997, IBS announced today that it will forego all plans to develop a revised edition of the NIV. IBS has abandoned all plans for gender-related changes in future editions of the New International Version. While trying to mitigate the ferocity of the controversy and avoid censure and boycotts by such powerful groups as the Southern Baptist Convention and Focus on the Family, IBS effectively abandoned the original vision of keeping the NIV ever up to date and broke faith with CBT, the independent body responsible for the development and maintenance of the NIV. Now this is where it gets really interesting, and this is where something occurred to me that I think is just fascinating. It says the controversy did not go away, nor did critics of the NIVI continue to support the IBS and the unaltered NIV. So the contention from the NIV side of things is that people that were against gender neutrality really at this point in time, in the late 1990s and the early 2000s, didn't support the IBS and the unaltered NIV 1984. They were already reacting to what had been happening in the late 90s. And so it says here, in fact, the Southern Baptist Convention sponsored a new translation of the Bible through Broadman and Holman Publishers, the Holman Christian Standard Bible, HCSB, of which the New Testament appeared in 2000. Other critics served as advisors, reviewers, or translators of an evangelical revision of the Revised Standard Version, RSV, published in 2001 as the English Standard Version. So the HCSB and the ESV were really reactions According to this, to the New International Version Inclusive Language Edition, conservative people who were against gender-inclusive language wanted to make sure that they had translations that were not going to go down that road. By the way, in the late 90s is when a group of scholars got together at Focus on the Family in Colorado Springs, and they developed the Colorado Springs guidelines for translating in relation to gender language. So out of that whole late 90s conversation, debate, and you could even call it debacle with the NIVI, you had really a push for these other translations. And it says here, ironically, both of these versions use inclusive language more frequently than the NIV. Now, it needs to be said parenthetically here that they're talking about the NIV84, not the NIV that we have today, or even today's New International Version. They're comparing these translations, the HCSB and the ESV, to the NIV84 when they make that statement. Some of the most strident voices demeaning the TNIV are associated with these new versions, a situation many translators and publishers consider a conflict of interest. So this is pointing out that sometimes in Bible translation debate, you do have to watch for a scholar who says, well, I don't think that translation is very good, but you find out that scholar is associated with the development of another translation. And so, yeah, you do have to look for bias and possible conflict of interest when you listen to different scholars talk about other translations. So it says, in light of these developments, interaction with evangelical scholars supportive of a revised NIV, including the CBT, and a reassessment of the original vision for the NIV, the new leadership of IBS has taken the steps necessary to honor that original vision while honoring their commitment not to change the NIV. So what they were trying to do at this point in time, and again, this is the early 2000s, is they wanted to update the NIV to be more gender inclusive, or what they might call now gender accurate, but they also had made a commitment, it sounds like, not to change the NIV84 at this point in time. So the results were announced on January 28, 2002. The 1984 edition of the New International Version will remain the NIV and will stay in print for as long as there is demand. Now that's really interesting. The revision, though identical to the NIV New Testament by more than 93%, bears a new name and acronym, today's New International Version, the TNIV. So that's the Bible I was showing at the beginning, the TNIV, which shows its relation to the classic NIV, but also sets it apart as the offspring of the NIV that will undergo regular revision to keep in step with advances in biblical scholarship and changes in English idiom. So it sounds like what they were saying at this time was that the NIV 84 would stick around, and then today's New International Version would be the updated edition that they could continue to revise to keep it up to date while keeping the 1984 around. Now, a big question here is, why didn't the NIV 84 stick around? Why didn't they continue to publish that? My theory is that a major factor looking at this information is the development of these other translations. The HCSB and the ESV essentially covered that area of the market that the NIV 84 was a part of. So you could actually in some way blame some of the push for these other translations for the demise of the NIV 84. Now, I'm saying this somewhat controversially, but it is a way to look at things here, and I think it makes an interesting point. So I just find it really fascinating how different events cause different kind of a chain reaction of different things to happen. And now, of course, what we have today is the NIV 2011, basically kind of scaling back a little bit of the changes of the TNIV, but still is more of a gender accurate translation. And then you still have the ESV, but now the HCSB has been updated to the Christian Standard Bible. So I think you kind of see the lay of the land in Bible translation has kind of restabilized, and these different translation these different translations fill different niches. But the late 90s, early 2000s was a time of transition. You could already see that things were heading in a certain direction. And I just thought it was so fascinating that it's very likely that the 1984 New International Version would have stuck around. It wouldn't surprise me if it would still be here today in print, possibly, if it weren't for the English Standard Version and the Holman Christian Standard Bible. So I don't know if you agree with that assessment. I'd love to hear what you think in the comment section below. And do you think ultimately that is a good thing, the way everything turned out? Or do you think it would be better if the English Standard Version and the Holman Christian Standard Bible didn't disrupt the, you could call it the conservative end of the Bible translation market? So I'm interested to hear what you think about all this, but I thought you might be interested in a little bit of that background on today's New International Version, which is no longer in print. It really was around from 2005 to 2011 when the NIV was updated. So it was kind of a short-lived stopgap measure in order to have an updated NIV, but continuing to print the NIV84 at the time. So interesting stuff. I'd love to hear what you think, but thank you so much for taking some time to listen to some of my thoughts on this, brought to you from A Frisch Perspective.